I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away in a mountainous country, there was once a prosperous village, and its wealthiest resident was a rich merchant, a widow who had taken over her husband's business when he died and had seen it flourish under her care. Whatever the villagers wished to sell, be it fruit, goods, fabric, even gold, this clever woman would buy well and sell well. She was respected far and wide for her business acumen and the fairness of all her dealings. She had just one child, a beautiful daughter called Kansuki, who she trained to follow in her footsteps. And the two of them coped very well with all the problems which confronted them. Kansuki, for her part, was very popular with all the young people of the village and loved to tell stories to the little children. Naturally, she had many admirers among the young men who lived in the area, so the widow kept a close eye on her daughter, anxious that she should marry well. Now, some miles away, in the middle of the almost impenetrable forests that covered the mountains, lived a young woodcutter. Handsome though he was something of a mystery to the villagers. Nobody even knew his name, and he hardly ever saw anybody. He lived quite alone, cutting his wood and selling it to those who made the difficult journey to his tumble-down hut. He enjoyed his solitude and knew well the ways of the forest. One afternoon, when he was on his way home with yet another bundle of wood, his attention was attracted by the alarm cry of an eagle. As this was unusual, he decided to investigate the cause. Peering through the trees, he saw that it was Kansuki, walking all alone. His eyes followed her beauty for a few moments, and then he turned to go, leaving her to her own thoughts. But suddenly, he heard her cry out and saw that she was being attacked by 3 ruffians who carried her off despite her screams and protests. The woodcutter did not hesitate. He ran along the paths he knew so well, hoping to cut them off and to rescue the girl. confronted the three villains squarely and demanded that they release Kansuki immediately. As it was 3 against 1, they just laughed at him, even although the woodcutter was carrying a fearsome-looking axe. With some hesitation, the gang leader challenged him to fight. The woodcutter contemptuously threw away his axe, whereupon his opponent drew a knife from his belt and leapt at him, confident that he could easily dispose of this troublesome meddler. Much to his astonishment, the villain found that this was not the way things turned out. While he floundered for breath in the water, he heard the woodcutter's mocking laughter fade in the trees as the man hurried after the 2 other villains who had made good their escape, still carrying Kansuki with them. The woodcutter soon caught up with the second man, who, turning to face him, found himself on the butt end of the heavy axe. Round and round the woodcutter twirled the unfortunate young robber, faster and faster, until he felt his head would spin off his shoulders. But the woodcutter seemed quite unperturbed at their dizzying speed. The robber was no match for the strong woodcutter. He knew when he was beaten, and he ran off as fast as his legs would carry him, the woodcutter's laughter ringing in his ears. That still left one robber, the one who held Kansuki captive. For although she protested and struggled as hard as she could, her strength was no match for his, and he dragged her on and on through the undergrowth. The woodcutter followed as quickly as he could, but it was not an easy trail to follow. There were so many paths they might have taken. But helped by Kansuki's cries, he soon found them. Although this was the fiercest of the 3 robbers, and he had a vicious knife, he also was no match for the woodcutter, who quickly relieved him of the knife. This man, too, would be all the better for a bath, the woodcutter decided. Now he had to find Kansuki, who had run off as soon as she could see a chance to escape. Just as the woodcutter thought he had seen her in the distance, the first robber, seething with anger from his ducking, jumped out behind him. "You just haven't learned your lesson, have you?" the woodcutter demanded. "Well, if 1 bath a day isn't enough for you, you had better try having another." Again, the robber was no match for the woodcutter, and in no time at all he found himself well and truly out of his depth. As he spluttered and shouted terrible curses, the woodcutter gave him a cheerful wave and set off again to look for Kansuki. At last he found her trembling in a hollow, very shaken by her experience. He coaxed her gently, as he would have done a wild animal, reassuring her that all her enemies had been defeated, and that he wasn't an enemy but a friend who would look after her and see that she was safely restored to her family. His calm, quiet words gradually soothed the frightened girl. She studied him closely and thought she had never seen anyone quite so handsome. She was relieved that such a wonderful person had come to her rescue, and she eventually agreed to go with him. Gently, he took her by the hand, and slowly, for she was still trembling, he led her back to his small hut in the woods. He told her she needed to rest a little before attempting the long journey back to her village, and Kansuki had to agree. So he settled her down comfortably, talking all the time to take her mind off her ordeal. He asked her what she was doing all alone in the forest. She explained that it was the anniversary of her father's death, and she had visited his tomb to pay her respects. The day was so beautiful that I decided to walk home over the mountain, but then I got lost, she said. That was when those men attacked me, and, she added, smiling shyly, that was when you came to my rescue. I was very pleased to be of assistance, the woodcutter modestly replied. He made her remain until she felt quite better. He brought her cool water from a stream to bathe her bruises and scratches, and generally made her feel so much at home that already Kansuki found herself falling in love with the strange and handsome young man. He made some refreshing tea, quite unlike anything she had ever tasted before. Never had anyone treated her with such gentleness. Never had anyone spoken to her so courteously. She couldn't believe that a humble woodcutter would have the manners of a prince. But when she asked him what his name was, all he would tell her was that he was just the woodcutter who lived alone in the forest. When he had made quite sure that Kansuki felt well enough, he said he would escort her back to the village. Although she assured him that she was quite all right and needed no help, he could see that she was still shaken by her ordeal and insisted on taking her all the way home to see her safely back with her mother. Besides, he wanted to make sure she didn't get lost again, and it would be better to be safe than sorry. And it was true that Kansuki was in no fit state to make the long walk home by herself. She was extremely grateful that the woodcutter was so considerate. Slowly and carefully they walked through the forest, with the woodcutter guiding her footsteps and supporting her as her strength failed her. When at last they arrived at the village, everyone gathered round to hear what had happened. She told her mother about her adventures and how she had been rescued by the woodcutter, and her mother could not thank him enough. While she comforted her daughter, she looked curiously at the strange young man, who looked extremely uncomfortable at all the praise and thanks that were being lavished on him. For Kansuki especially couldn't praise too highly his bravery, resourcefulness, and kindness to her. Her mother thanked him again and again for rescuing her daughter. The whole village was enthralled at the story, and the more the villagers admired him, the more the woodcutter became embarrassed. He declined all their offers of food and drink and would accept no reward whatsoever. He rose abruptly to leave, telling them that his service was nothing and that he was delighted he had been able to help. "No need to thank me for doing my duty," he said, and hastily left. Kansuki's heart sank as he left. How wonderful he had been to her. Her admiration glowed in her face. Her mother saw this, but said nothing, hoping her daughter would soon forget the mysterious young man. Kansuki couldn't wait to tell all her friends about her adventures. She was full of praise for the young man. How handsome he had looked when he rescued her, how bravely he had overcome the ruffians. Although her mother tried to divert her mind by making her work even harder, the woodcutter occupied all Kansuki's thoughts for many days to come. As it was unlikely he would come to the village, she decided to go in search of him to thank him for his kindness. She made careful preparations for her journey, and then one afternoon set off back into the woods to find the young man who had become so dear to her. He saw her hesitant approach, but pretended he had not seen her, while she timidly wondered whether or not she should speak to him. Pretending to be busy with his washing, he watched as she slowly came forward and greeted him shyly, hoping that he didn't think she was too immodest in coming to the forest to see him. But he welcomed her warmly and seemed pleased to see her again, asking her how she felt after her adventure. "I have come to thank you for your great kindness," she replied. "I know you do not like to be thanked, but I hope that you will at least join me in the picnic I have prepared for us both." The woodcutter was touched by this charming invitation and readily agreed to share the picnic she had prepared with such care. So they spent a very pleasant afternoon together, with Kansuki falling deeper and deeper in love with the woodcutter. And yet, although they talked of many things, and it appeared that he had travelled to many distant countries, she still knew no more about him than she had done before they met. Who he was, where he had come from, what his name was, still remained a mystery, and pry as she would, Kansuki was unable to discover the answers. There was always a barrier between them. The woodcutter never told her about his family. He never told her about his mysterious past. Kansuki, though puzzled, was so much in love with him that she no longer cared. Just to be with him was enough. He was certainly a mysterious person who followed a timetable of his own. After that day, Kansuki often tried to seek him out, but would find his hut empty. nor was he working in the forest nearby. She brought gifts for him, which she would leave outside his door, hoping he would accept the gift and know who the giver was. She always placed them in such a way that he would not be under any obligation to her in accepting the gifts. The woodcutter appreciated Kansuke's tact and concern in giving him these presents in such a way, and always accepted them. Sometimes, though, she would meet him, and they would go for long walks together, or they would sit by a stream and talk of many things. Every day that they met, Kansuke felt she loved him more and more. She thought that he loved her, for although he never said so, he always seemed to be delighted to have her company. Never in her life had she felt so close to a man. I must marry him, she thought. I can love nobody else. One day she arrived at his hut to find it empty, but she decided to wait for a little while, just in case he should appear. And sure enough, very shortly she heard his familiar footsteps. Eagerly she spun around to see her beloved, but how different he now looked. No longer was he dressed in his usual rags, but in the magnificent costume of a samurai. She was astounded. What did this mean? He explained to her that he had committed a great political crime many years ago and had to flee his country. But now the government had changed, and he was now free to return to his people. Much as he loved Kansuke, this was a journey he had to make alone. Despite all her tearful protests and pleadings, he would neither stay nor would he take her with him. She was devastated. She watched her mysterious woodcutter disappear and thought her heart would break. At that moment, she felt she would never love anybody as she had loved him. But Kansuke was very young, and there were many days ahead of her.